My name is Michael Wheeler, a member of the Athenaeum since 2004 and author of The Athenaeum, More Than Just Another London Club. I'm sitting in the room that Charles Darwin referred to in a letter of August 1838. "I go and dine at the Athenaeum like a gentleman," Darwin wrote, "or rather like a lord. For I'm sure the first evening I sat in that great drawing room, all on a sofa by myself, I felt just like a duke. I'm full of admiration at the Athenaeum. One meets so many people there that one likes to see." This 100-foot-long room on the first floor of Decimus Burton's palatial clubhouse has been described as the finest drawing room in London. It's been the scene of countless social interactions and discussions on every topic under the sun since Burton's clubhouse opened in 1830. For 6 years before that, the Athenaeum had been based in a temporary clubhouse over the way. With the bicentenary in mind, 2024, some of the senior members here came up with the idea of marking the occasion with a substantial history of the club, worthy, they said, of its worldwide reputation over 2 centuries. Having hatched their plot when walking on Exmoor, 2 of these individuals, Harry Kinloch, then chairman of the General Committee, and Brian Gilmore, a trustee and former chairman, sounded me out on the basis of various talks I'd given in the clubhouse. "Sorry, too busy," I said, before crawling back a fortnight later to say, of course, the book should be written by a 19th century specialist, and let's talk about the project. It would clearly take at least 6 years to complete, and I needed to start soon, while I still had the health and energy to see it through and to fit in with my existing writing schedule. So it would need to be published ahead of the bicentenary. This was agreed. I wrote a proposal for the club's General Committee, which in February 2011 appointed a history committee chaired by Brian Gilmore to prepare an agreement. Clubs love committees. A memorandum of understanding was approved by the General Committee in July 2011, and the project became my daily task. 10,000 hours later, in terms of research and writing, it was finished. 12 chapters, 6 months per chapter. The research was divided between exploring the broad savannas of the club's political, intellectual and cultural hinterland and the narrow defiles of its wonderfully preserved archive. The broad savannas, books on the history of science, for example, on many other specialisms represented by the membership, on the 2 world wars, on the history of other clubs, and hundreds of Victorian and Edwardian memoirs, many of them lacking an index. These were explored in the club's own library, the finest in London's clubland, in the nearby London Library, founded by Thomas Carlyle, later a member of the club, and in the British Library. The London Library in St James's Square is not only a lending library, 15 books at a time for country members, but it's also open stack. Now, it's common knowledge that influential individuals were members of several clubs in the early 20th century. Only by trawling through a run of who's who, shelved in a corner of the top floor of the London Library, did I discover that some of them changed their numerous club affiliations from time to time. A rather surprising fact that should serve as a warning against hasty generalizations. Much of this wide-ranging research among printed books was carried out in my own library, which includes a run of Punch, that extends from its first issue in 1841 to the rise of Hitler in 1933. As I researched and wrote chapters about those years, I read the whole of Punch, or should I say, all the pages passed under my eyes, and this proved invaluable in putting me in touch with what was going on politically and culturally, week by week. Punch was always at its best when puncturing pomposity, and the Athenaeum could be extremely pompous at certain points in its history. In the later 19th century and early 20th century, the fact that 1,600 candidates were waiting for a decade and a half before coming up for election was regarded as a badge of honour. Outsiders regarded the club as conservative and intellectually grand. In 1902, Alfred Kinnear placed the Athenaeum at the head of the erudite clubs of London, a magnificent temple dedicated, in a sense, to literature, the church and the arts. But outside what Ralph Neville called the foremost modern literary club, its self-proclaimed reserve and dignity were often interpreted as frostiness towards non-members and downright hostility towards guests, who were known as strangers. This room in which I'm sitting, the drawing room, was actually labelled the library on the original architectural drawings. And up until the Second World War, the furniture in here was arranged down the middle of the room, as in a country house library. This was a place for scholarly pursuits, with billiards hidden away from view. Indeed, so quiet was the Athenaeum that Punch reported on the club's addiction to dancing, singing, boxing, and late-night debauchery in the only full-page article on Clubland in the history of the magazine to that date, Mr. Punch's Untrustworthy Guide to London of 1906, proclaims that gambling is so rife among the hierarchy of intellect at the Athenaeum that the frequent headline, "Raid on a West End Club," 9 times out of 10 refers to a descent of the police on the Athenaeum. Waterloo Place is dull and decorous enough by day, but at 2 or 3 a.m, the spectacle of a bevy of prelates, judges and fellows of the Royal Society flying precipitately before the minions of Scotland Yard lent it a most engaging animation. Well, George Morrow's cartoon says it all. Apart from visits to a few archives outside the club, including the City of Westminster, King's College London, the Royal Institution and Lambeth Palace, the archival work was done here. The Athenaeum's archive is a remarkable source, clean, carefully preserved and catalogued by our archivist, and rich with unpublished material. So I sat in the corner of the South Library on what had once been Thackeray's chair, working my way through 200-odd years' worth of committee minutes, reports, membership lists, candidates' books, and so on. The setting for the research was glorious. The subject matter, not always so glorious, indeed pretty dull at times, deep in the minds of the club minutes, but then enlivened by finding nuggets that revealed so much about the club's aspirations and policies, its financial crises and intellectual triumphs, and its mundane day-to-day housekeeping. Take, for example, an entry in the General Committee minutes of 1838, the year of Darwin's election to this literary club and of the crowning of the young Queen Victoria. The club shared an unwritten code of behaviour, which was generally followed by members. In fact, the Athenaeum quickly developed its reputation for being rather stiff and scholarly in atmosphere. But special occasions did not always bring out the best in members. When elaborate preparations were made for members and their families to view the coronation procession in 1838, we read in the minutes, the first supply for luncheons was considered enough for 1,000 persons, and would have been ample had not members carried off whole dishes of sandwiches and cakes, in spite of the orders of the committee and remonstrances of the servants, to different parts of the house. Afterwards, broken glass and china were found in the galleries, balcony, and even on the tops of the water closets. And a pail full of fragments was taken up in the drawing room and balcony the next morning. Shock, horror. The archive also contains particular documents that are invaluable to the historian, such as the leather-bound collection of papers associated with the centenary celebrations of 1924 and of the first banquet since its foundation, held in 1902 to mark a signal achievement by a number of members. 9 of the 12 recipients of the Order of Merit, newly established by King Edward VII, were Athenians. As the research proceeded and chapters were written, I reported on progress every 6 months to the History Committee, which I dubbed the Watch-Wheeler Committee. Being committified actually proved to be extremely helpful, especially as every other member focused upon a theme that I would propose in advance, some question on matters of principle on which I needed advice. Dr. Richard Davenport Hines, a leading historian and reviewer, and a member of the History Committee, was also my invaluable interlocutor, who read draft chapters as they were written and discussed them with me, also reporting to the committee annually. Only Richard was privy to my new discoveries. Otherwise, by the time the book came out, it would have seemed old hat. I benefited hugely from his wise comments over 6 years of work. I particularly recall a long section in draft on an acute problem of ventilation which afflicted the clubhouse soon after it was built. Richard commented on the margin that he was losing the will to live. Cuts were made. The aim from the start was to avoid duplicating material that is easily available in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography or Who's Who, and instead to focus on the membership's shared preoccupations from generation to generation and their contribution to national life. So the book's not in the traditional insular mould of club histories, but devotes attention to the influence, the sometimes decisive influence, of Athenians on the intellectual, scientific, creative, and official life of the nation. For me, the Athenaeum's relationship to the outside world is symbolized not by its large plate glass windows that look onto Pall Mall and that were smashed from time to time by the Luftwaffe and the London mob, but by the steps and the portico of its entrance on Waterloo Place. For it's in the traffic between the interior, with its unique facilities for reading and informed conversation, and the exterior, where members of the Athenaeum have been influential, that the genius of the club is defined. National trends are reflected in the club's formation, its later development, and its recent reinvention. while many of its members have helped to shape the institutional and public life of Britain through their contributions in a wide variety of fields. In the book, which is written for the general reader, I view the cultural, scientific and political history of modern Britain, from post-Waterloo to post-modernity, through the lens of the world's most famous literary club. Literary in the broad sense of being related to letters or learning. The Athenaeum was founded in 1824 as a haven for the leading scientists, artists and writers of the day, along with cabinet ministers, bishops and judges. Its founder, John Wilson Croker, was a true blue Tory who ensured that a majority of Whigs served on the inaugural committee, and that members of this new kind of non-partisan club, with its close connections to the learned societies, were elected on the basis of ability rather than birth. From its origins in the years before the First Reform Act, through to its current existence in the 21st century, the Athenaeum has adhered to the values that shape the liberal arts and sciences. It's always been hospitable to competing or indeed conflicting ideas, for example. In 1928, it was described by the Graphic as the brainiest club in the world. It certainly was 100 years earlier, and probably still is today. The book begins with a snapshot, or rather a worked-up drawing from 1893, in which J. Walter Wilson presented readers of the Illustrated London News with an image of the leading Athenians of the day who'd gathered in the drawing room on ballot day. Many of them are readily identifiable today. All of them were influential in their own day. The original framed drawing is exhibited upstairs on the second floor. Part 1 in the book takes its title from Croker's correspondence with Sir Humphrey Davy, whose help he sought in founding the club. Everything must have a beginning. Chapter 1, Croker's London, examines what made the Athenaeum possible by visiting a number of centres of political and intellectual activity in London in the 1820s. In this way, we can see what Croker meant when he referred to these times as being propitious for the formation of a new London club for literary and scientific men and followers of the fine arts. Chapter 2 looks at the founding of the club, its first committee, the recruitment of the original members, as the first 1,000 were called, and the club's first home at 12 Waterloo Place. The story of how it took the club 6 years to build a clubhouse of its own is the subject of Chapter 3, which explains how Decimus Burton's design related to the Greek revival in architecture, to the most ambitious building programme in London since the Great Fire, and to the politics associated with Crown land. Here, it was fascinating to read in the archive about 2 other possible sites for the club, one of them in what is now Trafalgar Square, on the site of what is now South Africa House. Part 2, Victorian Grandeur, begins with a chapter which describes members' contributions to the development of an increasingly expansive and confident nation up to the 1850s, and the value of the club to members in terms of the exchange of ideas as well as of gossip. Then Chapter 5 considers the club's tradition of high thinking and plain living, and the building structural problems which posed a threat to the exactness and comfort that members expected. Based upon new findings, both architectural and bibliographical, I relate the problems of the club to those experienced in Barry's new Palace of Westminster. Chapter 6 examines some of the flashpoints in the club's history between 1860 and 1890, when liberal opinion in politics, religion, science assumed the ascendancy in Britain, and the Athenaeum strove to maintain its balance of tolerance and balance in the age of Darwin and his supporters, whose views conflicted with those of most of the ever-present and often conservative bishops. It's at such flashpoints that the relationship between national developments and the life of the club, conducted on the margins between the private and the public, is particularly revealing, and that the benefits of club membership to the leading intellectuals of the day become clearest. The title of Part 3, Reserve and Dignity, refers to the prevailing manners of both the club and polite society that I mentioned earlier. Chapter 7 focuses on the period from 1890 to 1914. During a period of prosperity, the Athenaeum reaffirmed its identity as the leading literary club in London and celebrated the success of its most eminent members. In Chapter 8, entitled Culture Wars, the history of the club relates to that of Britain over a short period of the 4 tumultuous years of the First World War. Punch showed the Kaiser mounting the steps of the clubhouse, just one example of the club's entrance being used in a symbolic way. Unusually and possibly uniquely, the club's long-established tradition of attracting members who combine creative ability with a readiness to engage in some kind of administrative or public service now bore fruit at a time of rapid development in many fields during the war. The clubhouse was particularly busy at lunchtimes, when those who were running things in Whitehall and those who were writing the war, so to speak, could meet and talk in confidence. Chapter 9, entitled A Room Full of Owls, considers the 1920s and 30s. Decades of economic turmoil and social insecurity. Although the traditions of the club were still fiercely defended in the interwar years, this was a period of innovation, with the ending of the ballot, the introduction of bedrooms for members, monthly talk dinners, and an annex where ladies could be entertained. Change, or rather adaptation, was underway. The 3 chapters in Part 4 bring the story of the Athenaeum up to the present. Chapter 10 looks at the Second World War, particularly focusing on the contribution of Athenian scientists to the development of radar and of medics in the field of surgery, as well as leading thinkers on reconstruction after the war. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s is prominent in Chapter 11, along with the impact of Butler's Education Act and the debate on the new meritocracy. In the final chapter, I describe how the club has reinvented itself in the last 25 years or so, with the welcome addition of women to the membership and the rapid expansion of events at the Athenaeum, a development that would have astounded members of earlier eras. Even the first talk dinner was regarded as an experiment in 1926. Today, talks, concerts, films, discussion groups, dining groups, wine tasting, and so on fill the calendar and are in great demand. Outside visits to libraries, theatres, car rallies, ski slopes proliferate. When and why this expansion occurred, and how significant has it been in terms of the reinvention of the club, I ask? Once I'd delivered the book in August 2017, the club sought a range of opinions on how it might be published. Drawing on the expertise of one member of the History Committee, Bruce Hunter, a contract was eventually signed with the club's first choice of publisher, Yale University Press. Heather McCullum and her team at Yale's London division, all working from home during lockdown, have done a brilliant job, as have Goma Press, the printers in Wales. Sir Michael Palin kindly joined me for a conversation about the book, which is now on the club's YouTube and is available on the website. The General Committee decided that all members should receive a complimentary copy, an exercise that was carried out quickly and efficiently by the Secretary, Jonathan Ford, and his staff. I have to say that writing this book has been both a privilege and a pleasure, even during those long shifts deep down in the minds of committee minutes. As my acknowledgements testify, I'm indebted to many fellow members and to friends outside the club for their help and advice on a wide range of topics. Since the book's publication, I'm grateful for the many messages of appreciation from current members. Also to those members who've drawn my attention to errors, particularly in the final chapter. I'm extremely sorry to have mistakenly described Lord Mackay as the late Lord Mackay, and to have wrongly stated in an endnote that Professor Sir Richard Evans did not refer to Eric Hobsbawm's membership of the club in his biography of 2019, published after I finished my book. I missed the relevant page references in Sir Richard's index and had no intention of implying that the club was not important to him or to Eric Hobsbawm. Covering so many areas of the national life and so many disciplines associated with the membership, and then deciding on the basis of research what the main story was that needed to be told in each era, I've had to constantly select, compress, summarize, and keep moving on over 2 centuries of the club's history. But others, starting with some members of the History Committee, began work on the quite different task of drilling down into the fine detail of individual members' lives and careers. In a major spin-off project, the self-styled History Boys, all members of the club, have completed research into the first 1,000 original members, elected in the club's first year, work which is available to members for consultation on the club's website. And the work has continued on later years. The group are now called the History Volunteers, or voles among themselves. As a further spin-off from my own work on the history, there is, in my view, scope for further work on specific themes that I could only touch upon. Perhaps a series of Athenaeum occasional papers prepared in time for the bicentenary. I hope that the opening up of the archive, as recorded in the 55 pages of endnotes in my book, and in articles by fellow members now appearing regularly in the Library Committee's digital publications, will encourage others to enjoy researching and writing as members of a club which has always nurtured the life of the mind.